Hello, I'm Matt, and this Loxley Quality Time tutorial is to help you with this painting, Mediterranean Sun, from the Cantisso collection. If you haven't already watched our techniques tutorial videos, please have a look at them before starting your project. They give you some valuable information about painting with the quality time range and help you get the most out of your quality time. This video contains specific information about your chosen painting, but we assume that you're already familiar with the general techniques covered in our tutorial videos. Mediterranean Sun features a Trani, located in southern Italy on the peaceful Amalfi coast, whose origin dates back to the 1st century AD. The town is separated from other larger settlements by a rocky mountainside, which gives a magnificent backdrop to the white and pastel-coloured, sun-soaked buildings which nestle together like a 3D jigsaw. The clustered houses with their shady porticos, steps and narrow alleyways are interspersed with iconic churches and ancient watchtowers overlooking the Mediterranean. The residents have retained their own traditions and identity, as well as their own dialect. Right, with this painting I'm going to start with the sky, and I've mixed up this blue using 50% white and 50% of the lighter of the two blues in this pack. There is a technique video on painting skies which gives you information on how to do this. Recommend that you watch that before you do this painting. And I'm using horizontal brush strokes, quite long brush strokes, and then even when I have to cut in along the edge of the horizon here, I'm finishing off the brush strokes horizontally. Even when I'm cutting along the edge, it's not horizontal. This is important so that the sky looks right. So you've got a very clear sky and it needs to look very smooth. So you want as less brush strokes as possible. If they're all going the same way, they won't show in the paint. Using it slightly darker shade for the top, and then as I'm coming down, just adding a little bit of white to the blue, a little bit more white, because it's already got white in the mix, but just a little bit more so that it's paler towards the horizon. This is often the case with skies, and particularly on this one. See, it's a bit paler near the mountains, and I'm being very careful not to overlap onto the mountains, just following the lines along, because the paint's transparent. If you go onto the hills, it'll show through. So I'm cutting around the mountains carefully, and you can use bigger strokes in this area in the middle, and I'll have to go around the bird very carefully as well. So nice, long, even brush strokes. In the instructions I've put that you can add a bit of water, and I haven't done with this mix, but it's just if you find the paint's a bit stiff, just add a little bit of water if you think it's necessary. It's impossible on stage one to get the sky looking totally right. You always be a bit patchy at stage one. And I'm going to paint around the edge of the canvas here. You'll notice there's no nails or staples on the edge, and we've done that deliberately so that even if you decide not to frame the picture, it looks finished. This is one of our pioneering products we came up with. Right, now I've finished the sky, I'm going on to these mountain hills here. And I've mixed this very pale colour, which I find works well, yellow and white. And I want to keep these rocky mountains, I want to keep them pale so they don't take away from the foreground, so they keep in the distance. I'm just following the lines. I'm going to maintain the individuality of these hills by painting them as individual mountains, even though at the moment it's almost, they're all the same colour. And the brush strokes following the natural slope of the hills and coming down like this, just as if you imagine rainwater, the way that would run off the hills. You'll see that the lines, the outlines show through the paint, and this works well because then you can see where to paint in stage two. So I'm just working my way across here, nice gentle brush strokes, and you can use whichever brush you find easier. I've actually been using the small one because of these areas here, and I'm now going to finish off with this larger brush, just cutting in there on the edges. And then I'm going to add in a little bit of green with my small brush while the paint is still damp. I'm just going to, with not very much paint loaded on, just work in some green into where these lines are, which is like the crevices in the mountain. Just gives the hill a bit more dimension. So only just a tiny bit of green, and then you're just like almost just influencing the surface, tickling it with a bit of green here. By the time you put your shadows on them, these hills and mountains will look a bit darker. So I find it best to keep them light at this stage. Always mix on the light side because the paints tend to mix darker than you'd first imagine. you can refer to your picture, the photograph. Now I'm going to work on these near hills, and I'm using yellowy green mixed up mainly with yellow, and I'm not painting the whole area. You'll notice I'm leaving where these buildings are marked. If you look at your photo, you'll see there's quite a few buildings on this hill. We're not going to be able to paint them all in detail, so we're just going to give the impression of buildings. So if you leave these areas, and again we're retaining the individuality and following nature's flow of the hills going down like this. Using the big brush here, but if you're more comfortable with the smaller brush, or you can use a combination of them both. Just adding a bit more green in so I can keep the shape of this hill here. You can tell it's a different hill. You don't want them all to merge in with each other. You can even mix the paint on the canvas, just like different shades of this nice green. You'll notice where the buildings are, I've changed the direction of my brushes, so I'm going to be working horizontally, picking up the direction of the buildings. The buildings are sort of lying out horizontally here, so I've just left it looking patchy at this stage. Then I'm going to mix up my building colour. I've got a grey mixed up now, and I'm just very small brush strokes in these areas here. And if you can mix two different shades of grey, paler one and a darker one, it works better, makes the buildings look more interesting as well. Randomly putting these blocks of colour in, so it's just like an impression of buildings. Small brush strokes again, getting two shades now. That makes the buildings more interesting. You can even add some pure white, just like where the sun's catching the buildings. Okay, so I'm now doing the sea, and I've mixed this bluey green colour using white and blue and a small amount of green, and I'm using horizontal brush strokes and again cutting round so I'm not overlapping it onto other areas. The bigger brush is better for this because it's a bigger area. Apart from, you can use a small brush if you want round the rocks and the coastline if it makes it easier. I'm brushing the paint out a bit thinner here because I want to see these lines come through, the outlines on the canvas, so that I can pick up these reflective areas. Quite an interesting colour. I suppose this is it's Mediterranean. You can tell it's not an English water. And even if you have to cut in at a different brush angle, if you finish off the brush strokes horizontally, it doesn't matter if it's not perfectly smooth on this stage. In fact, any brush strokes when you're doing water, it's okay if they show. It's not so critical as the sky, because it actually looks like ripples in the water. Just cutting around the rocks. Nice, gentle, long brush strokes. That's what you need. I'm now going to do the reflections of these buildings in the water, and you can just see the outlines faintly through here. I'm bringing the brush this way but just moving it slightly side to side, and then as I come further out, just with less paint on the brush like this. If you do it while the first coat is still slightly damp, it works better. These are the reflections of the buildings reflecting down on the water, and then I've got the reflection of the bridge here. Follows a bit of a curve like this. We'll go over these again at stage 2, so they'll become more finished. On the still water, you've got these lovely reflections. I'm now going to do these rocks. I've mixed up this grey colour using mostly white, just with a little bit of dark brown, which actually makes a very nice grey. And what I want to do here is keep the individuality of these rocks, so you don't want them all merging into one. So using different shades of grey, working across here like leopard spots to start with, and then going in with a lighter shade, and even bits of white where the sun's like catching it. So if you put the paint on unmixed, getting bits of grey and bits of white, the more contrast you can get with stone, the more real it looks. And again, we can put more detail in later into these rocks. At the moment it's just looking like spots on a giraffe, different shades. For the stonework across on this bridge, I'm going to use solid grey, all one colour. With the jagged stones you can use different angle brush strokes, but here, because it's laid down, even if I have to cut down like that, then I'm finishing the brush strokes like this, so that any brush strokes will look like marks in the stone. And then I'm leaving this archway here because that is a red colour. Obviously got red brick. They've used two different materials in these archways, and you'll notice the lines coming through, so I can pick up at stage 2 on these stones again, just covering them all basically with this pale grey. On these stone areas, I'm following the natural line of the bricks. If you imagine that the brush is running in the same direction as the stone or bricks. Again, I've left this archway. This bit here, when it's like a natural stone, just the stone rocks, you can just follow nature's way. So you'll notice from the photo that the fractures in the rock are running down like this. Put the paint on quite thick so that you're leaving some brush marks. So for the rough rocks, you're wanting different shades of grey, and then for the smooth stones for the wall, you're wanting a similar shade, and then we'll just add a few of the markings later, just finishing off in that direction again. It's okay to go over the railings bit because we can paint those over the grey. The red brick isn't so obvious on these archways, so I'm just going over the whole lot. Could even use the bigger brush for this if you feel comfortable. Some of these areas where it's lighter, just adding a bit of white in, and I'm putting it on quite thick so that you get the texture here. For these stones here, I'm just doing selective areas because there's a bit of greenery on these banks. These rocks here, again just following the natural contour of the stone. Any brush marks just look like the little fractures in the stone. Careful not to get onto the buildings, leaving the areas where the vegetation is going to be. And if you refer to your picture, you can see you're just building up layers of paint. You know, when you've done stage 2 and the layers on top, it looks better because the paint shows through. So I'm now doing some of the vegetation on this hillside here, and I've mixed up this light green using 50% yellow, and I want to try and create a few different shades of green in this hillside because the vegetation looks better that way. So I'm just doing it in patches like this, and then I'll mix a slightly different shade and fill in between. This way it looks more like real bushes and trees and things. Again, not going onto the sky, just following the outlines. If you use the small brush, it's better, and then you're using brush strokes in different angles, and then just following down the hillside where the plants are growing in the rocks. So I've mixed a paler colour. You can put a bit of texture in, would look good as well. Put the paint on thicker, and then you see you're just getting different shades of green coming through. So I'm now doing this seagull, Mediterranean gull, and I've mixed a bit of blue with white for the areas under the wing to get a bit of shading. Although the bird's white, the actual feathers are all different. And under the tail, a bit of a shady area. And at the bottom of the bird's body, going up to the head here. And I'm just going to get some pure white. Well, it seems a bit pointless painting white on white, but you actually get the texture. So I'm putting the paint on quite thick. I'm using the small brush. And then with the dark brown mixed with a bit of white, just put a bit more shading under the wing here. Get these individual feathers. And it's just like shading, so you're just influencing the colour. As I come up here, because I've got less dark brown on my brush, it's mixing with the wet white and blue. So it's getting this shaded effect. You see it fading. And you can just come back in and keep adding a tiny bit there. Not much paint on the brush, and then just smooth it out, shade it in until you get happy with the colour. For the legs, I'm just using the tip of the brush, and this is just the dark brown on its own. So very careful, small brush strokes. Its legs dangling down like that. And also for the tips of the wing feathers and the head, a well-loaded brush, but just using the very tip, hardly touching the canvas, just tickling the surface like this. So I just put a white dot there. When that's dry, I'll put a dot in the middle. And then for the beak, it's just the red. And again, just loaded right at the tip here, just the tip of the brush, hardly touching the canvas so that it just catches it like that. So I've done these orange tiled roofs here and across here with 50% red and 50% yellow to make this colour. And I've also just done a bit of the washing orange as well there. And then I'm going to do the eye on the bird now that the white's dried, using the dark brown right in the middle of the white bit. It's a bit easier that way than trying to draw a white ring round the eye. You see I've put more detail into the wings and the body of the bird. Doing some of these buildings with these pastel shades. I've mixed up pink using red and white and working my way across, keeping to the individual building shape. You can go over the windows with this paint because you'll see them through. You'll see the outline through. And you can make different shades using different amounts of white, adding a bit of white, make a bit of a paler colour for the back building here. Now doing white, and again you can paint over the windows because they'll show through. Try not to leave too many brush marks in this white because they're smooth rendered walls. And then for some parts you'll need to do different shades of white, so just add a tiny bit of dark brown, creating different shades of white. So I'm just doing some of the washing that's hanging out on this line. A bit of blue there. And while I've got the blue, there's a blue car, so I'll just do one here, one of these is blue. And then go back to my washing line, the yellow item. You can put the colour on quite thick so it looks bold. So I'm just doing this brick arch, and I'm using very small brush strokes with my small brush in the direction of the bricks, just working my way around the archway. Just putting in these railings, just very small brush strokes with the tip of the brush, this blue and white mix. So just doing it over the grey. Keep loading your brush and just work your way along. So I'm now doing these windows using dark brown, and it's the small brush I'm using, just little brush strokes. Just keep loading your brush. Putting in the windows and the doors, these dark areas. Give a bit of contrast. And then over the doors is and windows is a tiny little line at the top there. For some of the areas where there's it's not quite so bold, I'm just using white mixed with the dark brown. Some of the doorways are not totally dark, but just a shade dark. You can go over these doorways and windows again in stage 2, so they look more bold. With this dark brown, I'm just putting the windows in these cars there, and that's my stage 1 finished. Now ready to move on to stage 2. Right, so I'm now doing stage 2 of the sky, and I've mixed up my blue again. And what you'll notice in this stage is that the sky starts to get rid of its patchiness. In fact, the patchiness will go on the whole picture. And again, I'm just doing the same brush strokes, long horizontal brush strokes. There are no clouds in this sky, so you can afford to just do big long brush strokes right the way across, but just be careful around the gull. I'm just adding a bit more white in towards the horizon here, brushing out all the brush strokes so you've got a nice even sky. I'm going to do these far mountains now, these hills here, and I'm using a slightly darker shade of green, and I want to try and create different greens by altering the mix slightly. Again, I'm running in the direction of the slope of the mountain, and I'm putting more darker green to make a feature of like where the lines are. Always finishing the brush strokes and the down at the angle of the hillside. Stage 2, this starts to become more realistic looking. Whatever paint is underneath shows through in the second stage. You start to get this depth building up, makes the picture look fantastic. Okay, so I'm coming to the nearby hill, and again I want to retain the individuality of the hill, so I'm following the shape of it with this colour here, and again I'm going around the buildings, so I want to keep those, and I'll be going over those again. Just do all the green areas, slightly different shades of green, just gentle brush strokes. Because it's vegetation, you can vary the angle of the brush. I'm just thinning out this bit here where the paint's been put on a bit thick. You want a patchy effect with the grey and the green, so from just looks like far away buildings. With this darker green colour, it's best not to overload the brush. A little bit of paint and then very gentle brush strokes. Building these layers of paint up, putting it on a bit thicker here, and then I'm going to brush it out in a minute. So what you'll notice is that I've kept this shape of the hill and this one here, so they've got their own individuality. And I'm going to go on to the grey bits of the building next. Tiny bit of dark brown mixed with the white, and then I'm just, again, different shades of grey. Well, I've got one shade, I just work away across just little bits at a time, and I'll mix up a different shade and come back. You're not covering the whole area, just selective brush strokes. White brush strokes in between as well, to remember it's a sunny scene, and the white bits where the sun is catching the buildings. I'm now working on stage 2 of the water, and I've mixed my colour, and again using horizontal brush strokes, get rid of this any patchiness in the water. Doesn't matter if the paint isn't properly mixed, like I'm getting blue and green streaks in this, but it's smooth, overall smooth, but the colour is interesting and varied a little bit. You're getting the green showing through underneath, it's looking interesting. Again, just working around the stones, working a bit more into these reflections. So all the time you're just building it up, and it becomes real fun, this part, because the picture starts to appear more and more. See it coming to life. I'm now doing stage 2 on this vegetation here. There's mainly green with just a little bit of light brown over these areas. You don't have to cover the whole area. You're done in stage 1, but you can just build it up with the small dabs. Plenty of paint and just small dabs. The more contrast you can get, different shades of green, and just makes it look more interesting. You're working around the grey areas, which are the rocks here, and across to the hillside. I'm not loading my brush very much for this bit here because I don't want it to be too dark. I want this hill to be more predominant. Try and keep a sharp edge on the edge of the hill where it meets the sky. Small dabs, individual brush strokes. See the vegetation appearing. You can put the paint on quite thick, then you can get a bit of texture just using the tip of the brush. You can come back to this any time, any point, build up the layers. The more time you spend on it, the better the finished result will be. I'm going to do a bit of work on the rocks now, going back in with my grey colour, made up of brown and white, tiny bit of brown mixed with white, just working in shades of these grey, these interesting colours appearing now, keeping a bit of white in there as well, some areas like this where it's lighter, putting the paint on quite thickly so you're getting a bit of texture. Brush strokes are actually working as part of the rock. The other thing is I'm just using just pure brown to pick out some of the detail in this nearer rock. They're just tiny dots and tiny, like you're putting in the lines of the fractures of the rock, almost like hair width brush strokes. So only the paint that's on the brush is touching the canvas, not the actual brush touching the canvas. You can start building up some of the detail in stage 2. While I've got this colour, I'm going to do stage 2 of these doors as well, windows, just to make them a bit more bold. Looks like black, even though it's dark brown. Black's a very flat colour, so we try and avoid using it, but this works just as well. Just going to work my way across these stones, putting a tiny bit of detail in on the stone wall. So you're mixing a shade of grey, just putting a few little individual stones in there just to give the suggestion of the stone wall. That's my stage 2 all complete now. I've worked across the whole sky here, so that's all done. Then working down the picture on the hillside, on the mountain here, I've added green in fine lines just to pick out the crevices in the mountains and kept the distinction of these hills. On the seagull here, I've done stage 2 and more detail on the feathers and the black tips, and I've gone over the face again just so it's more intense. On the water here, I've built in these shadows, I've added a little bit of yellow just to give it more reflection, and I've put some darker areas in here as well just to give it more contrast. These stones here, I've gone round the edge of some of them with dark brown just so they stand out individually, and I've added a bit of yellow here where on the photo I noticed where the sea had been washing up, it had obviously a bit of seaweed or something growing. All these buildings have had stage 2 painted, and I've gone over some of the windows again, and it looks a bit flat at the moment, but when the shadows are in it'll give the buildings more depth. And on the archways here, I've picked out with different greys, put some individual stone work in, a bit of yellow on the sand here, and the archways I've built in a bit of shading. With the dark brown, I've done little tiny dots to look like the individual stones where it meets the water at the edge here. All this vegetation area I've worked in here with my green and light brown, give it more depth. And down here on the rock, using the dark brown, I've done tiny little dots and little hairline streaks just to make it look like real stone, and down here as well. Now starting stage 3, which is the shadows, and I love this stage. It really brings the picture to life, gives it dimension, and I'm going to start on the buildings here. I've mixed up some shadow paint using the blue and red. Don't forget the tutorial on painting shadows, which gives you more information. I've actually, for the buildings here, I've mixed it with water, and I'm using the smaller brush because it's quite a small area I'm working on. Just going over very carefully. If you look at your guide where to do it, where to paint them, then you don't get the shadows in the wrong place. You can refer to your picture as well. You can build it up in 2 layers if you want to darken any of these shadows. So I've just left this little area here where the light's shining, and then in these archways I'm going to use without water. So this is the shadow paint just with no water added. So I want more intense shadows, I want darker shadows. Basically, the lighter the shadow you want, then just add a bit of water. I've finished this off in the direction of the stonework so that the brush strokes that show through look like part of the stonework, like it's supposed to be there. You can go over these shadows where they want them darker so it's more intense. I'm just picking out some of the areas on this rock here. This will give it more contrast and depth. Keep referring to your picture and colour guide. Because the shadow is transparent, shadow paint, it'll show through the colour underneath. Okay, so that's stage 3 finished, all the shadows done. I've gone over some of these a couple of times, like in the darker areas, and I've tried to keep the character of all the buildings and by just using water with the shadow paint. Right, so I'm now doing stage 4 on the highlights, And some of these areas are already fairly pale, but I just want to really set them off. It's just where the sun is catching, just like the icing on the cake. You can refer to your photograph and add as many of these as you want to. They're just very small areas with the tip of your small brush, and it provides a contrast with the shadows. As well as the highlight areas, I'm going to do some very thin lines across the water just to set it off, very faint lines. By running it across these reflections, it ties it all in. There is the highlight technique video, which I recommend that you have a look at prior to doing your highlights. It gives you more information. The smaller you can get these little thin lines, the better. Just like the water shimmering. Done that a bit too big for my liking, so I'm just going to take it out a little bit. Okay, so that's my picture finished. Stage 4 completed, all the highlights done, ready for hanging up or framing. I've enjoyed this painting. Good luck with yours. Goodbye.